welcome everybody. Thank you for showing up. And we got a crowd here in West Portal, and we're going to talk about the San Francisco permit process. I thought, since we have a viewing party in Marin today, one of the things we could also talk about, if there's either questions or if there's some thoughts from the Marin crowd about the local policies, because one of the things that's very different is in San Francisco, we have a united county and city. And so everything that we talk about for San Francisco applies to the whole city. Whereas in Marin, there are many multiple local districts that have control over building inspection and permits in each of the local areas of Marin. But a lot of this stuff doesn't really vary a lot from one place to another, but the local traditions may vary slightly, especially in Marin. So we wanted to talk about something that is a mystery to many people, which is the San Francisco permit process. And there's a reason that it is kind of a mystery to an awful lot of people, and that is that it has tremendous inconsistencies.
Yes, you can, pull up to the planning or the building department desk and get assigned a planner or someone to look at your plans or what have you, and one will give you a completely different answer than the other. So it's very, very frustrating, the lack of consistency in it. So I know when we've had to pull permits in the past, we would hire a permit expediter because of that. And they literally, they take their number, and if it looks like their number is going to someone that they don't want to be talking to, they simply leave for the day and they come back the next day to get somebody else, because there's such a difference in the number of answers that you can get from the planning department.
A really good expediter or a good contractor will both do that well, where they'll, based on what planner happens to be at the desk or what building inspector happens to be at the desk, like Matthew says, they may just turn and walk away and come back another day, live to fight another day.
Right. It depends on the planner, right? So most of the time when you pull a permit, there's like a check sheet in the city that you get first. It's a little white slip, and it's like a routing slip. And so someone is deciding based on what you're trying to do, what departments have to actually look at it and sign off on it. So for example, I was going in to get a window permit on my property last week. And if the window is visible from the street or public space at all, like a park or what have you, they have very strict guidelines on what type of windows they'll allow you to put in. They want them to be original to the period. Essentially, they'll only allow you to have wood windows, full wood windows, which are very expensive, or they now allow aluminum clad windows in the city, but no fiberglass, no vinyl. The style has to look, you can't have sliders because they didn't have sliding doors when your property was built, most likely, the older properties. So they have to be casements, so they're very, very particular about it. But just to that point of who do you get, I went one day up to the counter and I got this really nice young gentleman who said, "Oh, I'm going through this process myself right now," gave me a lot of great advice. And I said, "Well, what about these windows?" He said, "Oh yeah, I can sign off on those over the counter for you." I said, "Oh, fantastic." So I went, got my slip, ran up to the building department to get it started so I could come back and see this planner. Well, the building department had closed. So I went back the next day, and the next person said, "Oh no, we will never sign off on that window style." So I actually talked to a historical planner who actually knew what she's talking about. They have a little book. So long story short, it's tough to say that you're gonna be able to get what you want. But I will tell you that if your client wants to put vinyl windows in the front of their house, they're going to be declined. It's about as far as I can explain that one.
So one thing that's good to make clear early on, which Matthew kind of touched on with regard to getting a permit through the city, has to do with two departments that exist in the city of San Francisco. One of them is the building inspection department, and one of them is the planning department. And they are two different groups with two different jobs really to get done. Planning department is looking at use and is looking at anything that exceeds a certain scope, if it exceeds the envelope of the building, so that you're going to be doing something that visually changes the appearance of the building. That's going to go before the planning department to make sure that it fits with the planning guidelines that the Board of Supervisors has set up for the planning department. The building inspection department is dealing with every single permit. So even while there are times when planning is not involved with your process, there is never a time that building inspection is not involved in your process. Building inspection always has to approve what you do. And what we were talking about how it really depends on who's at the counter and who's doing the approval of your project, that it varies between the two different departments. So not only do you need to be concerned about who you happen to make contact with and how agreeable they are with what you are proposing with one department, you actually have that with two different departments if the scope of your project falls into a requirement for the planning department to be involved.
Yeah, I personally have had, every quarter or so often they rotate the inspectors. So, I had a building inspector that was doing the electrical inspections for me, electrical inspector. And then first of the year they changed, we had somebody different. And thankfully for me, the new person was way more reasonable in terms of what they were requiring me to do. And so there is a lot of leeway on the part of the inspectors to sign off or create issues for you.
So the first question is, when is a permit necessary? And the easy answer and the most likely answer is always. It's an unusual job that requires so little in terms of expenditure and so little in terms of impact on the building that you would not need a permit. Like for instance, if you were probably putting a splash of color with a paint job on one of your bedroom walls, could you do that? Yeah, you could probably do that without a permit. But if you're doing something more major than that, you're always going to need a permit.
So some other exemptions, you're not required to have a permit if you're changing light fixtures or light switches for that matter. If you're rewiring in any other way, you do need to get a permit for that. It's also my understanding that you don't need it for flooring and you don't need it for landscaping that's not higher than 3 feet. So like if you're doing like just a sunken patio and the wall's shy of 3 feet. So the inspector kept coming out and asking what I was doing back there, and I kept having to point out to him that it's less than 3 feet, and he goes, "Oh, okay," and he ignores it. So there are a few things, but pretty much every countertop replacement should have a permit. A lot of the stuff that we do when we prep properties for sale is supposed to have a permit for it. So, but again, if you're just swapping out light switches, you're painting, maybe updating some flooring, you generally do not need a permit for that.
So in addition to the fact that there are two different departments, the planning department and the building department, there's also separate, in the building inspection division, there are separate permit supervisors, I'll call them. So the first one is the actual building inspector who reviews kind of all of the work of any other inspector that's involved in looking over the job that you're doing. But there's also an electrical inspector that's going to look over the electrical work. There's going to be a plumbing inspector that looks over the plumbing work. And if you need a mechanical permit, you may actually, if there's something that you're doing that requires some engineering, then that's going to require perhaps an additional engineer's inspection.
Yeah, my experience, at least in San Francisco, is that the plumbing inspector also handles the mechanical. And mechanical, just so you know what it is, it's things like your HVAC, your heat ducts, vents and flues coming from a water heater. It's that type of mechanical as opposed to like, I'm going to engineering, which is totally different. Bath fans, generally speaking, in the bathroom, that kind of thing. So,
one thing that's not in our outline for us to talk about today, but occurs to me really should be mentioned, is that you can go online and you can look at all of these permits. You can look at building inspection permits, you can look at electrical permits, and you can look at plumbing permits. You can do them online at sfgov.gov, I think it is. Yeah. And if you look for permit history, you can find it for a property. Now, how accurate that is however accurate the city happens to have been on the processing of the paperwork related to those jobs.
But unlike the 3R report that you guys are familiar with, which just gives a really short description of what that permit was for, someone at the 3R department is having to take what's in the online system, which might be a couple paragraphs of detail about what the permit is for, and they kind of squeeze it into one line for that 3R report. So if you ever have questions on what the scope is for that, you can look it up on the online system, and it gives you a broader scope. And you'll notice when you get to that system, there's a separate tab for building, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical. So you'd have to look through each of those regiments to kind of get all of it. Now, it's also my understanding that the job card, so when you get a permit, they give you a copy of the permit, which is a piece of paper, and they give you this folding card that has to be kept on site while the work is being done. And the building inspectors, all of them, will make notes in there. And not all of those notes make it into the online system. So if you're selling a property and there was recent work done on it, it might behoove you to see if the seller has the job cards, and if so, make sure they pass them on to the buyer because they can be very helpful.
Let's talk about job cards.
Sure.
So the job card is a card that on the initial inspection that the building inspector, well, actually when you're issued the permit, you get a job card. And you're theoretically supposed to have the job card on the job site at all times, although there are many contractors that fail to have the job card present at all times. It certainly needs to be there for sign-offs to occur. So the function of the job card is to keep track of who's inspected what at what date, on what, and which inspector. And you get initials during the process. So there might be a rough inspection that just looks at everything while the walls are still open, there, which includes electrical and plumbing work. And then after the walls have been sealed up, your building inspector is going to be back for an inspection, an overall inspection, to sign off on all of the work. And that's really the final inspection. And there's initials next to each of these on the job card. And the job card is a physical card. And I'll warn you though that the job card, sometimes the job card doesn't make it to where it's supposed to make it, or the records relating to the job card. Sometimes the inspector, if the inspector's on top of it, everything's been finalized on the internal system and everything looks great. Looks like you had inspections for everything, you're approved for everything, and it's all closed up. Other times you get building inspectors that come back to the office, and it's late in the day, and they don't file the paperwork that they need to file. And so even though you may have a job card in your hand that has a final sign off, it may be that that information didn't make it back to the internal system. And that's why it's so critical to keep that physical job card, because then if you have to go back to the city to prove to them, sometimes years later, that a job was completed, even though their system says it wasn't, the job card is what proves to them that, in fact, there was something finally approved there.
Absolutely. So another concept that I have to admit, as a working agent early in my career, I was under the impression that, you know, the seller, did they pull a permit for the kitchen? Did they pull a permit for the bathroom? Did they pull a permit for this room addition? And you don't really pull a permit for the kitchen or the bathroom necessarily. It's just for the whole scope of the job. So I could go down and pull a permit that included renovating the kitchen, the bathroom, update, you know, redoing the deck on the back, adding on a porch. I mean, whatever the scope is just on that. So you won't find separate permits necessarily for each of these major renovations. You're just looking for the description, which is why on the 3R report, when it's very short, it's sometimes hard to tell. But if you go to the online system, it'll give you a better idea of what the scope was that was done with permits.
I mean, you could have a 3R report that says home renovation, and you have no idea what that is. But then when you dig in and get some more details on that and actually see a copy of the permit that was filed by the homeowner or the contractor, it will detail that there's a kitchen remodel, a bathroom remodel, maybe a structural change or two, whatever happened to have been done.
Absolutely. So if you're switching gears a little bit into scope, so if you're actually not changing the envelope of the building, you're not enlarging that deck that was done with the permit, but you're just remodeling on the interior, and it doesn't include any windows you can see from the street, it's really fairly easy to go in and get what's called an over-the-counter permit, because you don't have to go to the planning department in that case. And you can go directly to the building department and with your plans, if you need plans. If you don't need plans, you don't need them. Like for replacing my front window and door on my property, I don't need plans for that. They just need to know what materials, you know, what brand of window I'm putting in. They have guidelines that I have to follow, but I don't have to do drawings, which is awesome. But the minute you change the envelope or you change anything, you have to, you know, not only show the drawing, the elevations, they also want you to identify the materials used on the property, you know, what the windows are now, what you expect them to be when they go in. So it's quite a larger process. But in our work, if you know, your client wants to update the bathroom flooring and the fixtures and the tile to get it ready for sale, they could probably get that really easily as an over-the-counter permit. So the contractor can go down, pull it, and be done with it. But the minute you talk about changing anything on the size of the outside of the building, or changing you know, the windows in the front, that kind of stuff, it triggers things that you got to be aware of in terms of timing and getting things done, because the city does operate very, very slowly.
So on this, in the same line of discussion, the permit process in San Francisco is set up in tiers. And so there's a standard tier, which is that you're not changing the envelope of the building, and that and it may be something more substantial than over what's called an over-the-counter permit, in which case it would be considered kind of a normal process, and it would be kind of the middle tier. There are two other tiers. One of the earlier tiers is an over-the-counter permit. We'll talk about that. And then in addition to that, once you exceed a certain scope of work that would include structural changes, weight-bearing walls, and exceeding the scope of the footprint of the existing property, then it goes into a more modified tier that involves the planning department. And this is one of the first things they're going to decide when you walk in the door is what tier do you fall into.
Right.
To start off with, the over-the-counter tier is kind of a myth and misleading in its description, because even though it is an over-the-counter permit, what they call an over-the-counter permit, that you actually, it's not one counter that you walk up to and ask for a permit. You actually walk in, start the process, they determine that you can do something over the counter, and you start off with the building inspection counter, and then they're going to want to send you to the other counters that are involved. And on some days, they actually have everybody in one room so that you can walk around the room and get your permit approved. And it's not really done over a single counter. It's done with the approval of many people. And so from different departments that make sure that everything looks like it's like electrical and plumbing. And even if it's over the counter, you still have to have approval from each one of those sub-departments.
And it does take some time. So even if a simple permit, you could be down at the building inspection department for 2-3 hours waiting in queue for the various initials that you need to have done and then to pay for your permit and get it. So it is a bit of a process to do that.
But the over-the-counter is an easier process. If you fall into an over-the-counter process, it's going to be a lot easier to get through it, and you're likely to be able to get through it in a day. Whereas if it goes through the normal process, when you submit your permit, you submit it and you walk away, because they're taking it into the system and you're not going to walk it through. They're going to put it through their system. It's going to take a lot more time. It's more complicated. It's seen by many more eyes.
So just, we skipped a little bit on that prior section, but I can dovetail it in here. So there are some other agencies or requirements depending on what you're building and what the project is that you might have to go through, but they're less common. Health department is one of them. If it's a residential property, you're not going to have to go to the health department, but if you were opening a restaurant, for example, you're going to have to go through the health department. The fire department, if it's a larger building, perhaps one that's high enough, you're adding a story to the building or expanding it such where they want sprinklers, then you have to go to the fire department. They have representatives at the building department that review your plans to make sure that the fire department is happy with what you're doing. And as far as egress, especially in commercial, you'll run into ADA review, Americans with Disability Act review. So they'll want to make sure that your bathrooms are all okay. In fact, you have to spend, I believe it's up to 10% of the cost of the project. 20 now? 20, okay. So thank you, Stu. Stu tells 20. So you have to spend up to 20% of your cost of your project bringing anything that's not in compliance into compliance. So that would include bathrooms, access at the front door, all those kinds of things. A good example of this for our friend in Marin, when we were opening the Marin office, we were hoping to make some changes to the lighting. And we discovered that if we didn't touch more than, I think it was 4 or 5 light fixtures, we were fine. But if we wanted to add that extra can light, you know, in the conference room or what have you, all of a sudden it triggered Title 24 review, and we would have required to replace every light fixture in the entire office with energy efficient LED bulbs. And so, which that was frankly not in our budget at the time. It was a $50,000, $60,000 expense just because you've gone in and asked for that extra little light can. So again, if you got a good architect, general contractor, permit expediter, they can kind of help you get around those gotchas. So we just made sure we were only changing whatever was allowed at the time, so we wouldn't have that triggered for us.
Now, one thing that I'll mention here that's also not on our agenda is the dirty little secret about work that is not performed with a permit. And it's a fact of life out there, and you can talk to any contractor that does regular work, that if you might trigger a substantial expense by changing out one light fixture, your contractor may say, well, you know what? We won't change out that light fixture. And then after the permits have all been signed off on and the inspectors have all gone home, then we'll wander in and we'll change out the light fixture.
Yeah.
And so that kind of thing does go on. It's not something we recommend to our clients that they do work without permit, but at the same time, you might as well be aware that that kind of thing takes place out there on a pretty regular basis.
No, absolutely.
We have a question and a comment from the webinar room. Matthew Golden asked, does foundation fall under mechanical inspection?
No, it would not be. Mechanical is going to be, gas flues, fireplace flues, HVAC units. Your foundation upgrades are generally going to require an engineer though. And then they have a set of special inspections where they come in and they try pulling the bolts out or pull to a certain level to make sure that they don't come out. They're going to want the engineer who made the plans to sign off on it before the concrete's poured, for example, make sure they're happy with it. That kind of dovetails a little bit into what they do and what they don't do. So the inspectors are really looking to see that broadly, the contractor's following the regulations. So a good example is if you've got metal electrical outlet boxes, they require there to be a grounding screw in the back of it. So the inspector would come into my place, the electrical inspector, and the only thing he really seemed to care about was touching the back of each of those outlet boxes to make sure that the screw was there. But they didn't look at the quality of any of the other work. So this idea that it's done with a permit and therefore it's quality work and someone's inspected the work, that's not exactly what they're looking for. They're looking to make sure you've got a separate circuit for the dishwasher and the garbage disposal.
Well, and another dirty little secret is that the inspector comes out, and if he's behind schedule, and especially if he knows your contractor,
Yep.
or he believes that the work has been done to a good standard along the way, might walk in the door and say, where's the job card? You hand him the job card.
Yep.
He signs off on the job card and says, see you later, and walks away, and he hasn't looked at anything.
Right.
And it's just because he either trusts the work that was completed or he doesn't care about the work that was completed.
Right. So it's not necessarily quality work just because the city has come through and looked at it, but you do have some assurances that it's, for example, vented properly. They're always looking at the venting. They're very concerned about anytime you've got a vent going through, from one level to the next, that it's packed for fire around it with fire retardant, because the fire will, take and just go right up the chase. So there's certain things that they really, really key in on, but others they don't seem to care about. So, so when planning department approval is necessary, obviously new construction, changes to the footprint of the building always requires planning. Changes in appearance, we talked about window replacement. Again, that only applies to windows that you can see from the street. And when you go down there now to the planning department, they've got a pretty elaborate electronic system where they can look up the property, see the street view of the property at multiple times in the past. So like, for example, if your client took out a big tree in their backyard and there's a complaint about it, they're going to go and they're going to look at this year, the year before that, 5 years ago, and try to figure out when did that tree disappear and how big was it. And so they've got this extra information now that they never used to have. So you kind of can't get around some of these things like you used to because they have the information. You have a question here?
So if you have windows that are not visible from the street, do they require a permit?
So the question is, I've got windows that are not visible to the street. Do I require a permit? Absolutely. They definitely are required. You just don't have to go through the planning department for them to sign off on the type and style. So you can put the cheapest vinyl window, crappiest vinyl window you could find in the sale rack at Home Depot, and you can slap that sucker on the back of your house. They don't care as long as you have a permit for it. But again, you can't put it on the front. So good question, Paul.
Yeah, so if you have a change, if you're making a change that requires planning department approval, would one go to the planning department first or go to the building department and start your process there and then they refer you to the planning department?
So the way, that's a good question. The question is I've got a permit I'm trying to pull that requires planning approval. Where do I start? And so when you come into the building inspection department, there is like a help desk at the very beginning. And you fill out, it's a pink legal sized form. You fill out your permit, or you could take it home and fill it out and come back. But you give it to that person first, and that person gives you the routing slip. So they'll tell you whether it has to go to planning, building, where it goes, and they'll help you understand where you have to start. So if you went to building, building's going to tell you, nope, you've got to go to planning first before we look at this. So generally speaking, you start at the entry desk, get your routing, but you start at planning and then you go on to building. So yes, and the question.
How about just a paint job on the outside of your house? I mean, it's visible from the street, but it's totally not structural or anything.
It still requires a permit.
Yeah,
but
they don't care. They don't. Planning does not get involved in what color you paint your house yet.
all right.
You can't do that.
I mean, that's happened in Marin, by the way.
Oh, okay.
A change of color would require, I think, planning.
Interesting.
If you, because this is my house, I have a deed restriction on my house for the color of my house.
So that brings up a good point.
What color is that, by the way?
Just like that, no, just a beige, it's beige, but it had to be approved by the planning department,
So you bring up
or
a good
planning commission, I should say.
So that brings up a good point. So on the 3-hour report here in the city that you get, and on your city resale reports in Marin, they're all different, but in the city at least, for sure, there's a question as to whether or not the property is in a historic district. And if it says yes, then there's going to be significant restrictions on what you can and cannot do, kind of like your paint color there. There's actually a property somewhere in the Bayview, this is a little different story, but the facade of the property was gifted to a nonprofit historic preservation society of some sort, and the rest of the house is purchased when it goes for sale. But you don't even own the slice of the front. So that's the extreme of it. But if you are historic, when you get to the planning department, like when I go to do my windows, the first thing they look at is which historic zoning are you? And I'm not in a particularly special historic zoning on my property. It's not a particularly interesting property. But if I were, a Queen Anne Victorian on Alamo Square, you've got to know that they want to approve everything. You can't touch the facade without getting into detailed drawings of what you can and can't do. So it depends on, are you historically or otherwise?
Yeah, so we're not historic. I'm not sure there's any historic Marin period. Maybe there is, I'm not aware of it, but we're on a hillside. So we're like the ridge crest, or we're the ridge line properties. So their thinking is, planning commission's thinking is, this is San Anselmo. Anything that is that high up is visible from anywhere. We don't want to be looking at a pink house. So,
Right.
Is there an easy way to look up to find out if you're in historic zoning? This is from Eduardo.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think there is a registry, but
There's a
I'm not sure where
property,
it's located.
there's a property data information desk. If you go to the online permit and history site for the city, there is a place you can look up by property, but I tell you, it's not consumer friendly. And then when you get to it, it'll give you a code that you're not going to know what to do with. So you would get, like on my property I was talking about, if I went there, it would tell me that I'm in historic area, whatever it is, but there's so many of them, I would have no way of knowing what that meant for me. When I sit in front of the historical planner, which has a different line, the planning department, and you go up to the front desk, they pull it up, they explain to you what it is, and then they tell me how that impacts my window permit. So if that answers the question.
That does. And we have just one more question from Eric. He wants to know if you'll be talking about permit expediters. Who are these people, their background? What do they charge?
We will, absolutely.
Great.
And then there was another question, Paul?
No.
Okay, great.
Okay, so one of the things that we should spend a little bit of time on is neighborhood notifications.
Yeah.
So when you are working on a project that affects the exterior shell or size of your property, and when there is, or when there is demolition, and there may be a number of other factors, you may be required to do what's called neighborhood notification. And so the city will then require you to actually provide them with a list of all of the properties that are within a certain radius of the subject property. And you're going to have to prove to them through some kind of acknowledgement from a company that does it for a living. There are companies out there that do these notifications, that you sent the notification out, when it was sent out, and who it was sent out to, so that they can verify that you met the notification requirements. And the notification requirements, like I say, impact everybody that surrounds the property within a certain distance. And particularly of interest is making sure that you contacted and notified your immediately adjacent neighbors, the ones whose properties abut your property, to make sure that if they have any questions or if they have any input, that they are allowed a due process to give their feedback on what it is that you're doing.
So that's the logical part of it. It's the neighbors right next to you, the ones directly behind you across the street from you that you do this notification for. One of the reasons why you can't do this notification yourself, and as Randall says, you have to hire a service to do it, is because anybody in the city and county of San Francisco can sign up to be an interested party in a particular geographic area. So when I went to go pull a permit for a deck on the back of my property, and I did my neighborhood notification, it included the local people around me that you would expect, but it also included what Randall and I would affectionately call NIMBYs, not in my backyard people. So that included the pastor of this Catholic church that was a mile away from my house. It included someone that lived in the Richmond district, and my property's in Silver Terrace. And so all of these people are notified, and any one of them can step forward and really throw a monkey wrench in your process. But you send those out, like Randall says, you have to prove that you sent it. You're required to have a project meeting where you have copies of the plans available. And so like I just did it at my house. I invited interested parties to come to my house. I could have done it at Starbucks on 3rd Street. And then people get to state their piece. And if they want you to make changes that are reasonable to you, then you just agree to them and you report back to the city and you're on your way. But if your neighbor is totally crazy and doesn't understand what you're trying to do, and you can't convince them, and he's jumping up and down in the backyard, screaming in a different language you don't understand, they can end up causing you to go to what's called a discretionary review hearing. And so they'll fight.
They have to pay.
They pay some money, yeah.
It's not a lot of money, but they have to pay. They have to put several $100s on the table to file a discretionary review, and then they get to say their piece at a review hearing.
It takes about 3 to 4 months to get.
So meanwhile, your job is delayed.
You're in a holding pattern. So again, that's why if your clients are interested in doing something that requires an expansion or adding a deck or something like that, they should really start early, because they could get stuck in this. I think it probably took me 9 months from when I walked into the building department until I got out of that discretionary review hearing. It actually took 2 or 3 weeks after the hearing for the results of the hearing to get back to the building department so that I could continue the process. So it can really delay you substantially, that notification. So your clients have to weigh whether or not it makes sense to really go the extra foot on the deck, or do they just redo the deck the current size that it is?
So this brings up a topic which Matthew touched on, which is this is the kind of situation that you want to avoid, is having conflict with any of these people.
Yeah.
And so there are ways to do that. And what you can do is you can meet with the neighbors in advance, invite them to your home to see what it is that you're planning on doing. And I would recommend cheese and wine, because you want everybody to come in and feel relaxed and feel like they're being reasonably received by you, and for it to not be a hostile environment, and have them look over the plans and talk with you about what their feelings are about it. You can also meet with the supervisor for your district and get the support of your supervisor in advance of the project, so that it's on record that you have support of the supervisor if it comes before the commission to review whether they like what you're doing or they don't like whether they're going to listen to the person who's complaining against you or not.
Right.
There's also, I recommend letters to the immediate neighbors, so that the neighbors that are right around you, whose properties abut your property, or just interested parties that might have concern over what you're doing because of height or because of considerations over whether it affects light or view. What you can do is send letters out in advance and ask them to either sign a prepared letter that you have given them or to create their own letter in support of your project. Because the more that you have of that in advance, the more likely it is that if there is somebody that complains, you're going to overcome the complaint and be able to do what you want to do anyway.
That's right.
And you want to consider in advance what kind of issues might come up. Are you impacting the light and view of a neighbor? And are you willing to make some compromises with regard to that? Because if you go down to the planning commission and they're having a review, a discretionary review on your project, you want to come across as reasonable if you want their approval.
Yep.
And the way that you do that is, okay, I understand this neighbor has an issue with that, and I'm willing to compromise by lowering the rooftop impact on their view by 3 feet or 2 feet. And so if you're doing those kinds of things, then you're coming across more reasonable.
So that's kind of the the insulated, I guess I call it city process. But in addition to that, there are several areas in San Francisco where there is some type of a merchants or a neighborhood organization that also has some input and sway on a regular basis. Most famously, Bernal Heights has a design review board where they want to review everything before it goes. And there was actually a lawsuit a number of years back where someone sued saying that the city was relegating their obligations and duties to this design board, and the person won that lawsuit. So, but that's another thing. I think on Potrero Hill it used to be worse when Dick Millett was more involved. He used to get involved in everything that was up there, and so having a meeting with that person, if you know about it, or if you're in Bernal, having a meeting with someone from the design review board in advance is probably a smart thing to do. There's also evidently there's one in Dolores Heights as well that I wasn't really aware of, but.
And also I'll mention that most of the, in terms of commercial, which we deal with as a company frequently, when you have a commercial property, Stu, you could talk about this, in one of our commercial neighborhoods like West Portal or the Castro District or Noe Valley or Bernal Heights Commercial District, then there may be specialized restrictions on, particularly on commercial operators, on merchants, that restricts what they can do, how they can do it, and whether they need to get approval to do it.
Sometimes they take it even a step further. Last year when I sold the Nob Hill Theater, it was deemed historical by the LGBT Society. And much like a few buildings out here, like the United Irish Cultural Center, we see that old 60s Flintstone rock on the outside of the building.
Yep.
Well, the buyer for the Nob Hill Theater is adding 6 units. The LGBT Historical Societies has said, not only do you have to keep that rock on the outside of the building, but if you're going to build up, you have to time travel back to 1960, find more, and continue it.
Wow.
Because it was overruled, but that cost 3 months.
Right.
Yep.
And you bring up a great point that there's money expenses and there's time expenses.
Sure.
And it's huge if you've got a contractor lined up to do the job, and maybe even you start the job and then somebody calls for a review, then it stops the job in its tracks. And you can imagine how happy the contractor is to have started a project and then have to stop in the middle of the project over a complaint that maybe you've exceeded the scope of your project, which is a very common complaint.
Yep.
When neighbors complain, one of the most likely complaints that they will levy is that you have exceeded the scope of your work. And an inspector will come out and look at your plans and compare it to what you've done on the project site, and will decide whether you've exceeded the scope. And I can tell you that when we did work at the 24th Street office, we had a neighbor that complained that we exceeded the scope of the work, and we had not exceeded the scope of the work. And so we were delayed while the inspector came out on their schedule, probably 2 weeks later, to look at the project, determined that we had not exceeded the scope of the project. And so they said, you can continue on with your work. And so we were allowed to keep going.
Absolutely. So some common complications if you're in the middle of a project, what kind of stuff comes up? Title 24, which is energy efficiency, is an issue. When we built out the annex at Market Street, the requirements for energy efficiency had been increased and just recently, and it caught everyone off guard. So we had actually installed all the electrical we called for the rough inspection and they went, oh no, this is completely different now. So
This changed 3 weeks ago.
yeah, so they had to rewire the whole thing because there has to be a computer system. There has to be, for every outlet on the wall, there has to be an outlet that's tied to a motion sensor and a time of day thing. So it only works from 9 to 5 and then it shuts it off. So, that kind of thing. So we had to completely go in and rewire the whole thing after we were done. Yeah.
Is Title 24 only for commercial space?
There are, I don't know the answer to that question, but there are equivalent energy efficiency requirements in both residential and commercial.
They're all called Title 24.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you know?
so.
You think they are?
Kitchens and bathrooms fall under it for residential.
24, okay, so yes, they're all under.
And closets, I think.
So one thing I ran into is I've got solar panels on my project. And so I wanted to put an electric tankless water heater. And I pulled my permit on a December 31st. And when the inspector came out, he said, oh, you can't do this. And then I said, well, really? And because they want it to be, them all to be natural gas now for some reason. But anyways, but since I pulled it on the December 31st, he was able to grandfathered in under the old code. So things change all the time and they don't always make sense. To me, it made sense to have electric water heaters since I've got solar panels on the roof. It's taking it all, it's doing the right thing, for the environment, but they don't see it that way. So it's tough. ADA issues can come up. You have to be careful about that. Other energy efficiency kind of stuff as well. Neighbors are probably your number one resistance point, I think. So if you can deal with them often and early, that's very helpful. I had a couple neighbors that wrote letters for me in support of my project. I had a couple of them that went, that neighbor of yours is a crazy person. I don't want to be on their bad side, so I'm not going to write a letter. But we like what you're doing. So you never know what you're going to get. The discretionary review, you have mediation on the outline here. Have you done that or seen that? Where you have to go for mediation?
I actually haven't. I'm not sure. I'm sure that when we wrote this outline up, that there was
something.
There must have been a due process there of mediation where you can take the party outside of the process and try to resolve the issue.
They prefer that that's how you handle it. And I know that one of the options, maybe that's what this was for, one of the options after the discretionary review was filed was before the hearing, if I wanted to, I could have gone to neighborhood mediation with the neighbor that was filing the complaint if I thought it would help resolve the issue. And you can't mediate crazy, so I didn't do it. I just went to the discretionary review hearing and won. So, but it costs you that much more time. So if you go to mediation, get it resolved, they can withdraw their complaint, then you can move on with the process. Okay, we covered that.
I think we can jump into expediters.
Let's do it.
So we already had a question, I think it was from Eric, about expediters, and there are expediters. They fall in and out of favor, and they change from time to time. But one of the places that I have commonly found people asking for references to expediters is on the system that we have that allows everybody to communicate through the internet postings about who's good right now. Because I mean, I remember that we had expediters 10 years ago that were great and were getting things done. And some of them are just either not as active or they're not as effective anymore. And so it's better to move on to other expediters. But there are a number of good expediters out there. A great expediter typically is somebody who used to work for the building inspection department or the planning department and now acts as a consultant because they can make more money and they're happier working outside the bureaucracy of the city. And what they do is they know who all the planners are, they know who all the building inspectors are, and that's what makes them valuable as an expediter. They also know what all the codes are. And so by keeping up on the codes and keeping good relations with planning and building, an expediter can say, let me help you, I'll act as your consultant, and you pay them by the hour to walk your project through the system, especially if it's a complicated difficult or controversial project, then you definitely want an expediter on your side, because it's nearly impossible to navigate the process by yourself.
So one good use of an expediter would be that maybe your buyers are buying a property and it's got an illegal room behind the garage or an unwarranted kitchen remodel, and your client wants to know what's it going to take to make this right, and that expediter is going to be able to walk them through the most likely scenario. They can't guarantee, but the most likely scenario. A good example would be, other one would be a condo conversion. We always recommend, if you can fast track your 2 units for a condo conversion, one of the first things you want to do is do a walkthrough with a good permit expediter, because he'll walk through and say, okay, the inspector's going to see this wiring issue, and that's going to lead them to worry about this one over here. So let's get someone out here and correct this one, so we remove the red flag, so when the inspector comes out, they're not seeing it, they're not creating a larger issue out of it. Maybe we can get by with less intrusive, not having to open up all the walls, those types of things. But they can be very helpful in kind of helping determine before you have the city come out what you need to kind of clean up and take care of.
And I'll just digress here a little bit and talk about something that we also don't have on our outline, which is variances. So if you have a project that under normal circumstances would not be allowed, but you believe that your project is reasonable, and you have a good argument for the fact that the city should approve it in spite of the fact that it does not fall within their normal guidelines, then you can file what's called a variance, and it's a request for an exception. And an expediter is particularly good and useful when what you want to do is outside the normal parameters of the city guidelines. And so they could help walk you through a variance to get it approved. And that's something that can be very valuable.
Absolutely.
What's typical cost per hour?
What's the typical cost on it? When I was hiring my permit expediter for my deck project, I want to say that I was charged $200 an hour, $250, something like that. But I needed like an hour of his time to review the project, and I needed him to be at the hearing, which he showed up to 30 minutes late, which saved me $125. So it worked out fine. So, but yeah.
But it was worth more than 125 for the nerve damage.
Yes,
waiting
absolutely. No, absolutely. No, it was fine. But they can be higher than that too. It depends on who they are. I don't know what Gary Bell's office was charging us. Do you know?
I don't, but a good expediter, it's like a good lawyer versus not a great lawyer. It's if you pay more, you should get somebody that's more effective and that knows more, and therefore can get through your project more quickly. And so it may end up costing you less overall, even though you may be paying significantly more per hour for a good expediter.
A good example of that is if he's able to get the project through without having the discretionary review hearing, and you shave 4 or 5 months off your project, that times your carrying costs, you just saved a ton of money. And so they're great in that respect.
Yeah, just one more comment that Matthew already made, but I'll just restate it, and that is that even though the expediter knows as much as they know, and they know as many people as they know, they cannot predict the bureaucracy. They're better at predicting it than you and I might be by a margin, but they still cannot predict what's going to happen. You can actually have a permit that's been approved by planning, approved by the building department, and then the inspector takes issue with something in the plans, and they'll say, no, I won't approve of that. And that's what they talk about. You can't fight City Hall. You've got City Hall standing in your project, and you can't fight them. If the building inspector says that something needs to change, it's hard to get them overruled by their supervisor.
Yeah.
So you better count on, you probably need to do whatever it is that they tell you you need to do.
Right. I've seen the reverse of that as well, where I had a building inspector on a project tell me, I don't know, why did they make you do this? This is like this extra thing that like you don't need to do. That's ridiculous. And so don't worry about it. Don't do it. And then they signed off on the plan. Of course, then you're left with plans that don't match what's been done. So, it's.
And that actually brings up another topic, which is that the plans that you start with may actually differ from the plans that you end with. And so if in fact the work project is somehow different at the conclusion of the project based on maybe demands of the building inspector, then you should do what's called an as-built set of plans. and the as-built plans actually document what was the final product that was approved by the city. Because otherwise, what happens is if somebody digs into the records to try to figure out whether the work that was done was approved or not, they may end up with the original plans. And what they see then is that it's not to plan. And so how did it get approved? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so what really cleans that all up is to have an as-built set of plans at the end of the project.
The Noe Valley project, one of the things that we did there is when you first walked into the office before we did the renovations, there was a reception desk and there was a finished steel post that was right smack in front of you when you walk in, and it's didn't look nice, but terrible feng shui. We wanted to get rid of that. So we got rid of that post and added 2 posts off to the side so that when you walk in, it's nice and open, which is what we have now. But we pulled the previous plans from when they expanded upstairs and got them to the engineer who prepared the plans for the permit. We get into demo, and what we found when we started doing the demo was that what we have is not what the plans said they were. So the engineer actually had to go back and alter the plans again for us, resubmit them to the city. So you never know what you're going to find until you start digging into a project.
Yeah, in my own home, there was, I wanted to open up the entry between the dining room and the kitchen and wanted to make it one opening. And previously it was 2 openings into butler's pantry and kitchen. It was very small and chopped up. And so we said, okay, great. We got plans that approved for the changes structurally to that wall. And then, like Matthew said, we did demo, and as soon as they knocked the wall open, they realized that there were heating ducts and plumbing running up that wall.
Yep.
And so guess what? That's what, if you watch any of those, any of the cable shows on working on home projects, that happens almost every project. There's something that comes up like that.
That's right.
Where you find out that it's not really what you expected and that there's more work that needs to be done. And that's why it always goes over budget.
So here's another cautionary tale, because I remember being guilty of this myself early in my career, where you'd go into a property and you would say, oh, well, you can just open this up and it'll be fabulous. And of course, and you looked at it and you're going, okay, you know enough about construction that you know that, this wall is a load-bearing wall and this one's not a load-bearing wall, as you can kind of see. And so when I went to do my deck permit on my property, the other thing we did is we opened up the floor plan, the living room, the kitchen. So I knew I had to put a support beam in on the load-bearing wall. So we put a nice steel beam in for that. But when we got to the building department with the set of plans, the non-load-bearing dining room wall, which is about 6 feet because it had a doorway in it, triggered $35,000 worth of seismic upgrades, because even though it's not a load-bearing wall, it's actually it's contributing to some shear strength to the building. So I had to put a 27-foot long I-beam in underneath that level of the property.
Slow down your project, added cost to your project.
Yes, absolutely. It was really fun because I'm a little bit on the hillside. It was real fun watching them get that 27-foot I-beam off of the truck to get it into the house. It was fascinating. They kind of jack it up and then they drive the car out from underneath of it and then they jack it back down. It's crazy. But you never know what you're going to run into, and something that looks simple could end up triggering something completely different.
So be careful of those sweeping comments when you walk through a property and tell the clients what they can and can't do.
Yeah.
So once you have a permit, if it's through the normal channel, it's not an over-the-counter permit, then once the permit's been approved, the city will inform you that the permit's been approved, and then you have to go pick up the permit. And it sounds easier than it is because that's when you pay. When you go to pick up the permit, that's when you pay for the permit from the city. And it could be a substantial cost depending on how big the project is. It could be a lot of money to pick up the permit. It could be in the multiple tens of thousands of dollars to go pick up the permit. I think the permit for Noe Valley was $125,000 to pick up the permit.
Wow.
I mean, it was an expensive permit. And there are sometimes fees that they use that opportunity to charge additional fees.
So
One's called an impact fee.
Right. So theoretically, your permit cost is based on the cost of doing the work. But what the city has done is they have like a little cheat sheet where they say a bathroom model is this amount minimum, adding a master bedroom is this month minimum, adding a deck is this month. So if they add up what you're trying to do and it doesn't and your number that you have for your estimate is too low, they'll just adjust it upwards for you. And then they will use that number to base the permit cost on. So it's really more it's almost like what you think you can get away with on the low side,
Yeah,
and you let them dial it up when you go to pick up your permit. They also, when you pick it up, that's when they give you your physical job card that we talked about earlier.
And one of the things that's important at this, while we're talking about this, is that when you do work to your property that improves your property, and you identify on your permit how much you're spending for that improvement, guess what? That's going to impact the next assessment for your property for property taxes. So if you do a $150,000 job at your property and you've documented it as $150,000, if it's truly $150,000 and that's reasonable, that's probably what the new assessment add-on will be, and that'll trigger a supplemental tax bill. But if you try to play it cool and not pay as much property taxes, and you think you're probably going to spend $150,000, but you put down $90,000 because you want the assessment to be as little as reassessment to be as little as possible. They may do what Matthew just said, which is they'll look at it and they'll say, no, you're not going to get all that work done for $90,000. So we're going to just adjust this up, and that's what we're going to reassess and add the supplemental bill on.
And you and your clients also can expect if your work is spanning a tax year, which starts on July 1st, you'll get a letter from the assessor's department and they'll say, what percentage of your project did you have completed on July 1st? You say 20%, and they'll assess you 20% of that cost for that year. And then the next year they'll do the other 80%. Yeah.
If they upcharge you, can you come back with like receipts or letters from contractors saying?
Yeah, you can, any tax assessment, this is a whole different field, but any tax assessment that takes place on your property or reassessment can be appealed. There's a process, a due process to appeal it. But you have to prove, like you say, that what you're saying is correct, and that the city inspector or the city appraiser that decided that was an unfair number, you have to prove them wrong. It's your burden of proof.
I don't think there's a process for appealing it when you're getting your building permit, though. If they tell you that this work is going to cost you $150 instead of $90, you have to pay that on your permit, and then you can go fight the assessor later. But they kind of rule the roost when it comes to the building permit.
Stu's got something.
I sold a 3-unit building on Folsom last year, and the day after the close of escrow, the buyer went and pulled a construction permit to replace one countertop in my seller's name, which was a big problem.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
One countertop took the whole 3-unit building down to the studs and tried to build out all these huge improvements that were simply not relayed in that permit process. So we had a little bit of an issue with my seller going, am I going to be on the hook for this?
Right.
And what do we do about that? And also, he got busted. You know why he got busted? Is because his construction crew was blasting music and making the neighbors angry while they were doing this, while they were replacing that counter.
Right.
Which was clearly more than a countertop, and they got busted. But that was a really interesting, it's our job to transfer properties. You got to protect your clients in that way as well. Because he got, lo and behold, at his new home in another city, this notice of this. I think the buyer thought that our seller wouldn't notice, but he sure did.
Maybe we can jump ahead and then come back, because one of the items that we want to talk about is notices of violation. And let's talk about that because we're already talking about the subject. So when a neighbor complains, which is the typical origin of a problem like this, then what happens is the building inspector will come out to the property and attempt to look at what the situation is to assess whether there's been a violation or not. And they have to be granted access. So they might come out, and if there's nobody at the house, they might leave a business card with a little note on it that says, please contact me about a complaint. And then if they don't hear from you, they will actually post it onto the front door of the property, and it'll say complaint filed and notice of violation. And you have to prove to them that you are not exceeding the scope of your project and that you have not violated any provisions of the codes. And you have to let them have access to your property.
And the best way to really piss off the building inspector is to exceed the scope of the permit. they get super, super grumpy about it. And there are so many things that they can look at and either sign off on or not sign off on. You do not want a grumpy inspector. You just don't.
And so when the inspector does get grumpy because you haven't been cooperating or you're rude or you're difficult, or they do find a serious violation, then what's going to happen is that they're going to create a notice of abatement that says you've done something wrong and you need to correct it. And there are multiple ways you can correct it. You've probably heard of abatements related to in-law units. And typically an abatement on an in-law unit says that you either need to legalize or demolish. And what that means is that if they've discovered that you've got work there, it's illegal, you have to either bring it up to standards, file a correct permit for it, get it approved, and then finally get it signed off, which is the legal remedy, or to demolish it, take it out. And either way, you need a permit.
Yep.
You actually need an abatement permit to do what the building inspection department is asking you to do. And not only that, I mean, these are the remedies that the city has to force you into complying with their codes. One is to issue a notice of abatement. And then if you fail to comply on the notice of abatement, and I've actually seen this before, then they can do the next step, which is to condemn the property. And when they've condemned it, first of all, when there's a notice of abatement, it's on record. And second of all, when there's a notice of condemnation, that's on record too. You can't do anything. You can't get a permit. You can't really do anything with the city until that gets cleared up.
And you can't transfer unless you got a cash buyer, because you can't finance that. You know, you just, it's a major issue. It has to be resolved. I have seen it, for example, like I've seen abatements for like an older Victorian where the paint's peeling on the building and it's falling onto the sidewalk or into the backyard or the neighbor's yard. And the idea being that you've got a lead hazard now that is, you know, falling everywhere. And I have seen it where working with the inspector, they will pull it from the property, pull the abatement for a period of 30 days if they know that there's a buyer that's coming in that's pulling a permit and going to deal with it. But that's purely at the inspector's whim, so to speak. But so normally if you've got an abatement like that, you can't transfer it until it's either dealt with and cleared, or you've got a cash buyer who is unconcerned about it for some reason. So.
Okay, so backtracking a little bit, let's talk a little bit about 3-hour reports. So what's included in a 3-hour report? Among other things, a permit history. That's one of the most critical things that we look for, is the history.
But only for the building department.
That's right.
You will not see plumbing and electrical permits on there, only building inspections.
The 3-hour report also includes status of the type of building, whether it's a single-family home or a 2-unit building or a 3-unit building. It's also going to indicate whether there are any outstanding violations on the property. And one of the reasons that the city mandates that a buyer of a property must receive a copy of the 3-hour report on resale of a property is that they want to make sure that the buyer sees any notices of violation before they purchase the property, sees what the permit history is. And this is a great opportunity to just say that when you're reviewing a 3-hour report, you're not just looking to make sure all the permits have been, you're not looking not just for what's on the 3-hour report, you're also looking for what's not on the 3-hour report. So if you see a kitchen remodel that's obviously been done in the last couple of years, and it's a substantial remodel, and then you go to the 3-hour report, but if there's no kitchen remodel permit on there, then you've got an issue that you need to bring up to your buyer.
That's right. So, and it also will list, and in addition to, the use, the allowed use, what the city thinks it is, the property is. It will tell you whether or not it's been designated as historical that we talked about earlier, that you would need to ask about if your client wants to do anything with the property that would change the facade. So you have to check all of that. Now, are there errors on the report? Yes, it's pretty common that there's errors in the 3-hour report. So it's a great starting point, but it's not the end point. If your buyer is concerned about whether or not permits were gotten for all of the remodeling that they're seeing, then they need to be doing a little more investigation on that, not just relying on the 3-hour report itself, because it may or may not be on there.
When we talk about the importance of a job card, one of the things that is really critical about having the physical job card in hand is when you find an error on the 3R report. Because you have to have proof that there's an error there, they're not gonna correct it. And one of the ways that you can prove that there's been an error is to come up with a job card that says, see, there was a permit, it was signed off on by the building inspector, and here I have it in front of me. And you bring that into the 3R counter, and they'll look at it. And if everything is genuine and in order, they will make a modification of the 3R report that reflects the accurate information.
We had a listing last year in the spring, Ventura Hill building built in the early 2000s. 3R report came back with, and it had sold a couple times. The 3R report had come back that the permit was expired. So evidently whoever had it before was sleeping at the switch, and their buyer's agent was sleeping at the switch as well. So it turns out that the seller actually died before the project was completed. And we thought it was gonna be a huge, huge problem. We got in touch with the permit expediter. It turns out that they were able to get a hold of the person's son who died or whatever. They had a copy of the job card. So they were able to show the city that all of the okay to cover, all the stuff behind the walls were inspected. And so all that was needed was the final inspection, which the inspector was to do a walkthrough at the end, and it would turn out to be nothing. But they didn't have record at the building department that the electrical and the plumbing and the mechanical had been signed off. The job card had that evidence for us, so it made it a lot easier to say, here, correct your records. So very important.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So we see often where basements have additions, and it's like, oh, this is an added laundry room. And then you can see there's like a living room, a bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, this is storage. How do we deal with that? And how is, I mean, obviously it's been permitted as storage, but it hasn't ever been used as storage.
Well, the quick and easy answer to that is all about disclosure. So the question is, what do we do when we find a space that's permitted for one use like storage, but it's being used for other purposes? And as a realtor, our main obligation is to make sure that any buyer that purchases is at a minimum aware of what the correct use is of the space. I remember selling a flat that had a huge 700 square foot attic space that was easy access and was a second story to the condo. And but the use was for storage. But like you say, there was a couple of home offices up there and a family room. And so we jokingly said that there were 2 offices and a family room stored in the attic space because the correct usage was storage. So if we want to stay out of trouble, what we do is we make sure the buyer is aware of the correct use.
Right. The other thing you'll see common is you see the room and bath behind the garage that they're calling it a master suite. Well, code, you can't have a bedroom that opens, you can't open into a bedroom from a garage. It's a code violation. I believe it has to do with the carbon monoxide concerns. So you have to have a vestibule that then opens into the bedroom. You have to go to a hallway and then into a bedroom. So that's your clue as a realtor that space is not really permitted for bedroom use. It's permitted for, maybe it's a family room, like the project I'm doing right now. What probably would be the nice master is permitted as a family room and a bedroom. And they specifically say no sleeping, it's not sleeping room for that reason. So we also had a transaction recently where there was a condo and it had another level. There was an in-law in there, but on the original permits and on the condo map, it's mapped as storage. And so it was all built out originally, and then they added the kitchen in later. So the bathroom and the room are legal space. No, actually it wasn't storage. It was like a media room or something. So it's legal living space, but it's not a legal kitchen. So you have to make that distinction as a client.
I wanted to jump back quickly. We talked about notices of violation and notices of abatement. And one of the things that we didn't talk about is the penalties around that, because if you have a notice of violation and you or have a notice of abatement or have a notice of condemnation, there are almost always penalties involved. And the penalties are discretionary on the part of the city. And they can range from 2 times the permit fee to 9 times the permit fee. And so, for instance, if it might cost you $1,000 to get a permit, and you find that the city finds that you are in violation, they're going to say, well, now you're going to have to pull that $1,000 permit, and we're also going to charge you a 9 times violation, so it's a $9,000 penalty. Now you can, one of the things that you do have available, or an expediter would have available, is the ability to go back to the city and say, hey, really didn't understand what was going on here, or this is a brand new owner that didn't do this work. We would like the city to have discretion and lower the amount of the penalty. And frequently they will lower it. And I've never really seen them go in the middle. It's either 2 times or 9 times. And so they go to either the minimum or the maximum. And so you can frequently get, the point is you can frequently get a penalty reduced if you have a reasonable reason for the fact that it was a violation in the first place. We didn't really talk, we focused on San Francisco, but I do want to say once again that if you are working on a project in Marin, you are subject to the local government supervision of your project. And that can be both good or bad. A local desk in Larkspur may have only 1 person there 4 days a week during certain hours, not there during lunch. You might want to check all that before you march down there and expect to see someone. Right. Because it may be a very small department that has oversight here. And once again, if you walk in and you're a little rough and rude, you're going to experience the reaction to that, which is not very much cooperation. Whereas if you're reasonable and you're polite, you're probably going to get more cooperation.
Can I make a comment on that? Just my own experience on my house. I had 2 phases. The first phase was done by an architect who was from out of town, had a little bit of a artiste kind of temperament and attitude. The local permit guys did not like this character at all. Very rough going. Second phase, guess what? Got a different architect. And this time I went to the planning people, the building people, and I said, you know any good architects?
That's a great idea.
Of course, they said, well, we really can't recommend anybody, but who are you looking at? And I gave them a list of like 3 or 4 names, and I said, well, this guy's pretty good. This guy's pretty good. So they guided me. No problem after that. And
you actually bring up another good point, which is that when you're dealing, especially with small governmental offices, frequently, and it's true even of big ones, like in San Francisco, as a homeowner, they will give you more room for error, and they'll give you a little more slack if you're pulling the permit yourself, and it's reasonable for you to pull the permit yourself, because they understand that you're a layman, you're not used to the process, and frequently they will try to accommodate a little bit more slack in that.
That's true. They do, however, you'll need to walk in if you're going to go pull your permit on your own property. You need to have just a quick letter on your contractor's letterhead authorizing you to pull a permit with their name as the attached contractor for that address and for the scope of the work. But as long as you have that or an email that from them, they'll let you go ahead and pull it. I don't know if this is true everywhere, but San Francisco is a little particular in who gets to pull permit. So the property owner can pull a permit. A general can always pull the permit for what they're working on. But as in a general rule, the plumbing inspector, the plumbing contractor and the electrical contractor have to pull their own permits, and they can do that online. The only exception to that is if your general contractor is going to be responsible for the entire project, they will let the general contractor pull the electrical and the mechanical and the plumbing. And so I've come down there and I pull this permit, and they try to tell me, oh no, he can't pull this electrical permit. And I remind them, oh, he's doing all of the project himself, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical. And then they go, oh yeah, you're right, he can pull this. But it's a little weird oddity in San Francisco. But you can spend hours down there standing in line just to get feedback that you have to go change something and come back for another several hours. And so that all adds up. You know, if a contractor is not having to go pull the permit, that's going to save them substantial time. Let's talk a little bit about the inspections, I think, because the inspections themselves are interesting. In San Francisco, at least, you can call the building inspector out as many times as you want. There's no additional cost for it. They're happy to, they'd rather look at it and help you solve the problem instead of doing it wrong and having to tell you to redo it differently. But the electrical and the electrical, plumbing, and mechanical, you get up to 3 inspections per permit. And then if you need to have them come out again, you have to pay an additional inspection fee. But with the building inspector, they'll come out as many times as you call them. But when you set up your inspection, you either get a morning appointment, which means sometime between 8 and noon, or an afternoon appointment, which is noon to 3:30, which is a smaller time frame. But you just literally, sometimes the inspector will call and tell you, hey, I'll be there around 10 o'clock, but most of the time, someone just has to be there. Usually it's your contractor that's sitting there, you're paying them to twiddle their thumbs for 4 hours if they come at the last minute, and it's just kind of the way it is. Don't really have
And sometimes they don't show up at all.
Well,
We've had inspectors where they set up time frame and then they don't show up, and you got to reschedule and you got to do it again.
Yeah. Questions?
I got a question about trees on the sidewalk. Who is in charge of them, and when can a property owner prune them under their own desire?
Well, one thing that happened, we recently had some legislation that said that the city was going to take on the responsibility, which seemed outrageous to me because the city has tons of money to spend, that they want to take on the responsibility of all of the areas in front of people's property. The way it used to work is that the city owned the space, owned the property that was between the sidewalk and the street, and they owned the tree. But you were still responsible for watering it and maintaining it. Well, they've taken on that task themselves now, where the city is now responsible, not necessarily for watering it, but for maintaining the tree. And I don't know why they did that, but I guess they wanted to have more control.
I was at the hearing when they debated that at the planning department, and it was Scott Wiener was pushing it really hard, and the number of trees in San Francisco has declined over the years, and so they're wanting more and more trees. And but yeah, I think if you had a street tree issue, I think you call the city department that handles it now.
We did that recently, and they scheduled us for 2.5 years from now to come out. And the only other choice that you have, you can't do it yourself. You have to choose. You have to hire a licensed arborist.
Yes.
Is kind of, but we're scheduled.
Okay, great. So the other thing that most people don't realize is that trees that are on your property in general, even in the backyard, if the trunk is larger than 12 inches, is protected by the city now. So you can't take that tree out. So I've got a tree in my backyard that I get out every once in a while and I measure how big it's gotten, because at some point we want to take it out. And once it gets 12 inches, we can't do it. So they've gotten serious about trees.
Yeah, I think they're serious about their trees.
Jeff, do you have any other questions from the online?
I do. Yeah, well, we have just one question from Chris at Noe Valley. It sounds like they're having a watch party there as well. Question is, can you clarify what constitutes as a legal bedroom?
Well, it's a good question. My understanding of a legal bedroom is that it has to have a light and air source that is large enough based on the square footage of the room. So your window has to be a certain size. It can't be just a teeny little window. There has to be a window or some other form of ventilation that is large enough to accommodate the floor space of the room. And in addition to that, they expect to find a closet in the bedroom, although that isn't always true because there are buildings in San Francisco in particular, and in Marin, Corte Madera, and San Rafael for that matter, that are older properties, where Victorians were originally built and Edwardians were built not necessarily with bedrooms. And so it's pretty hard to designate that a bedroom has to have a closet if the original construction did not include a closet.
So I have a slightly different answer in that I don't believe that there is a requirement for a closet at this point, but there is absolute light and air, and there's a minimum square footage that I can't remember what it is that they want. So, but it depends on when, what are you talking about? To Randall's point, Victorian age, there really wasn't a code around any of this.
Right.
And you're not required to bring it up to today's code. But today's code, if you built a place, my understanding is you don't necessarily have to have a closet.
You also can't walk through the room to get to
Right.
another room in the bedroom.
Correct. You can't. So the point made was you can't walk through what you're trying to call a bedroom to get to another bedroom or get to another room. You can't be the hallway to get
So
to
a
the space.
sunroom is an office, or
Correct.
it's not necessarily an additional bedroom.
Also use common sense. If people are going to show up and be disappointed, then maybe you call it a den. You want people to show up and be excited about what they see.
Yeah, along that point, it's better if you have something that might be 3 bedrooms, but you're not sure if you want to call it 3 bedrooms, because either the 3rd bedroom is either small or may not really qualify as a bedroom, or you have to walk through another bedroom to get to it, then you can call it 2+.
Right.
And that way you avoid having somebody disappointed by coming out expecting a big 3-bedroom layout, and it's not.
Got it. Any other questions you guys have?
Any
Anything else
questions?
online, Jeff?
Yes, we have one more that just came in from Noe. A double parlor which doesn't have a closet can be considered 1 bedroom.
A second
Yes.
parlor. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
As long as you still have one half of the parlor is the living room and one half is the bedroom, yeah, I think that's fine.
And my viewpoint is that one of the things that you might do if you're calling something a bedroom and it doesn't have a closet is to identify in your disclosure that that the second parlor is being used as a bedroom and does not have a closet.
Correct.
A lot of interest around this topic. Eddie asked, what if the sunroom is directly off the living room the way some bedrooms are?
Well, that's as long as you're not having to walk through the sunroom to get to another room in the property,
Or walking through another bedroom to get to the sunroom.
or walking through there. So if it's off the living room, I think it might be okay.
I would think so.
Gotcha. That's all we have for now.
And with that, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.